Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. For the last 2 years, Israel has been engulfed in a political crisis with 3 election cycles ending in a deadlock temporarily broken by the decision by the main challenger to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanjahun to join his government as a nominal equal partner. The price paid by Benny Gantzin was a split down the middle in his blue and white party, leaving him powerless to compete with Netanyahu in or out of cabinet. Less than 7 months into their government, they are all about to call for a new election, tentatively timed for next spring in March, with no end in sight for Jerusalem's political crisis. To analyze this topic, we're joined from elsewhere here in Jerusalem by Mr. Mitchell Barak.
Thank you.
Also joining us from the southern Israeli city of Beersheba is Dr. Jonathan Freeman, who is a lecturer at the Political Science Department at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us.
Shalom.
And also joining us in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. Welcome back. Give us a broader understanding on the latest developments pertaining to Jerusalem's political situation currently.
Well, regrettably, there are no vaccinations against political paralysis. And Israel has been, as you said, beset by this problem ever since late 2018. And we are going most probably to be involved in the 4th election in 2.5 years' time. Now, there are several possible scenarios how we get there. One has to do with the budget, if it is not passed by Christmas Eve because of the Israeli law. Another has to do with some parliamentary move by Blue and White, but this is really secondary. The problem is that the hopes invested in the government when it was formed, even though both partners declared to the High Court that they do not believe each other, that they're setting up a mechanism to safeguard against any loophole which the other guy might try to exploit. Nevertheless, it didn't work. There are charges and counter charges. It can't go on. And therefore, sometime early next year, we will have elections.
Dr. Freeman, how do you perceive the current situation in Jerusalem?
Well, I think it's really a battle of the Benjamins. I think that in the end, we're seeing that many parties and individuals want to take advantage of the current situation when it comes to the pandemic, to a lot of the economic hardships. I think that some of the individuals who are pushing for elections are looking at the polls to see that maybe Netanyahu is losing his power. They're seeing other individuals like Bennett who are rising in power. So I think part of what people are seeking to do is really change the current political reality, and maybe they'll be able to do so through a election that will bring about a new result that might bring a new government without Netanyahu as its head.
Mr. Barak, your perspective?
Well, I think the first thing is there needs to be a budget passed, and that was a kind of agreement, and part of the requirement of this government was that this budget would be passed, and it hasn't. Netanyahu is dragging his feet because he doesn't, once he passes the budget for this year and then the one for next year, which is really what the economy needs in a coronavirus type crisis, he loses the chance to really exit from his agreement with Benny Gantzin. So that's certainly playing on his mind. He doesn't really want to hand over the premiership to Benny Gantzin. So, and he thinks he's going to gain even after, his inept handling of the coronavirus over the past number of months. He thinks he's stronger because of the Bahrain and United Arab Emirates deal, and because of, the developments in the region. On the other hand, I give Gantz a lot of credit at this point, because Gantz is the one who's holding him to it and saying you have to pass a budget or we're going to elections. And Gantz has everything to lose because he broke away from his party with Yesh Atid. So he lost that opportunity to run again with him. And he's looking really horribly in the polls, meaning his party is crashing. I don't even think they're going to pass the double digits at this point. So he has everything to lose, but yes, he's still got to the point where he can't, he can't work with Netanyahu, and he believes that Netanyahu is not serious about anything from the agreement.
Mr. Owen, there were three separate cycles, which were actually not very different from the cycle when there was a viable government operating, just minus one party within the coalition of former Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, Israel Beiteinu, of course, which was basically frustrated with Netanyahu's promises on certain things that didn't come across too well. They moved to the opposition, and since then, one after the other, it seems like there's not really a big shift in the current political scene in Israel, other than if election will be held in the near future. For the first time since Israel's inception, the ruling party of Ben-Gurion at the time, the Labor, is going to disappear in the next election, according to the latest polls. What can we understand from this stalemate? And is this just one cycle after another until we run ourselves into the ground?
That may very well be the result. Hopefully it will not, but it's a war of attrition. And what Yonatan and Mitchell described is really a tug of war between Gantz and Netanyahu on who is going to be the interim prime minister or the prime minister during the run-up to the elections, because there are various clauses. If someone is held to blame for early elections, the other guy takes over or remains a prime minister. So this is why they're trying to juggle the budget and the other measures. There is a discrepancy between the situation as it is right now in the Knesset and the polls, especially regarding Naftali Bennett. And this is why it has whetted his appetite, because he is the right wing of the opposition. He is to the right of the current government, but he is not in cahoots with the other parts of the opposition because he stands to gain from elections according to the polls. And therefore, he refused to say whether following the elections, he will be willing to share power with Netanyahu. Now, the overarching event behind all of that is Netanyahu's trial, whose major part is set to begin next February. A few months ago, when Gantz joined Netanyahu, he gave him the best possible gift by allowing him to go to the High Court, say that he has the support of almost 80 of the 120 members of Knesset. Therefore, this reflects the will of the voters. And even though Netanyahu has not only been indicted, but his trial already started, he was deemed eligible. So this will hold true for the next election cycle too. On that regard, Netanyahu has gained from what Gantz did last May.
I'd like to refer the next question to you, Mr. Barak. You served as Prime Minister Netanyahu's advisor in the past. A long while ago, nonetheless, you did advise him. And one of the points that you keep coming back to is the fact that he's very patient and waiting for opportunities to arise, being very consequential with regard to his actions. To what degree do you think that the current situation is still within that context where he's just awaiting for the right opportunity to suddenly present itself and then seize that opportunity by various strategic maneuvers that may not always be presented to his political contenders?
I think we see this going on now, meaning, he the first wave of the coronavirus handled brilliantly. And I think that was because he wasn't even given the mandate to form the next government. So he had to show that he's in charge, he knows what to do, and so forth. By the second wave, he really had messed it up. Meaning there was no policy, there was no economic policy. He spent his time worrying about the annexation of parts of the West Bank and so forth, and we were caught off guard. And now what happens is he's brought these fantastic peace deals with the United Arab Emirates. Israelis are enjoying the sun and the splendor of Dubai and Bahrain, and they're traveling to these places. And it's rumored he was in Saudi Arabia. So there is really, truly a breakthrough in the Middle East, which we didn't have. And that's really an achievement. So he wants, on the one hand, everyone forget the coronavirus. let's concentrate. I'm the guy who's producing this new Middle East. And the longer we get from today, the more people that are going to be vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine, which is already coming into the country this Thursday. So he knows, as the Rolling Stones always say, time is always on his side, and his court case can wait, because as we get closer to March, or we have the elections in April or May, hundreds of thousands of Israelis will be vaccinated against COVID-19. The economy is going to start to kick back in. People are going to start to have jobs. There's going to be a certain optimism going into the spring, the Jewish holiday of Purim, of Passover, of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, and then that's where he wants to get to the election. And he thinks he's going to pick up all those people that left the Likud to go to blue and white or to go to Naftali Bennett are going to come back to him. And the people that are now committed in the on the polls, on the telephone polls to vote for Naftali Bennett are going to find that the guy's not organized. He can't put a viable, really good, solid list together. He has all these people, dragging on his coat from the extreme right, and he's just not going to look that presentable. And that's where he's going to want to be.
Dr. Freeman, Naftali Bennett's 21 mandates, if I'm not mistaken, in the last polls, or 23 mandates, and it varies around the 20s. It seems like it's very similar to the one that a different contender who just 2 elections ago was considered to be the kingmaker pre-elections, and then he got into the election itself and suddenly didn't even pass the electoral threshold. I'm speaking, of course, about Feiglin, who was thought to be one of the kingmakers for the next prime minister. Now, to what degree is such a reality also possible for Bennett, who just 2 elections ago also didn't pass the electoral threshold? Is he suddenly so well received by the general public while his actual base is a small marginal group?
Well, I think really historically we've always seen Bennett do very well in the polls, but when it came to the polling station, that came to a different result. I think that if we look at the current situation with the coronavirus, we've also seen things that Bennett has said that could be something that is used by the Likud campaign against him when elections are announced. Things that he said that we should do, and we didn't do it, and we actually did something else that was even more successful than what he said. He published a book about how to beat an epidemic, a pandemic, how to do it. I think that in the end, many of the people who are maybe answering those posters calling in might not be answering the same way when the polls are opening. I also think that Bennett, as we have seen, changes his opinion at times with who he's going to sit with, who he's not going to sit with. In the past, he said, I'm going to be with Yair Lapid, he's my brother. And then we're seeing his different answers that he's giving right now. Even just recently was in I think he visited some kind of market, and they asked him, go away from Netanyahu and I'll vote for you. And then he said, for what? So I think there is a big gap between what the polls project and what the polling stations project.
Mr. Oren?
2 points, please. One, there is a contradiction between what Mitchell said a while ago about Netanyahu's being successful during the first wave. It's a mythology already being developed, especially since he was in charge of the entire health establishment for several years, and apparently many reports showed that it was very poorly run. So people can be led by his marketing messages and believe it, but he did not prepare Israel for this pandemic and did not run the first wave properly. And the contradiction is that Bennett has risen in the polls because he was seen as the counterpoint to Netanyahu on the first wave, because he said, I am the defense minister at the time, let me handle it, the military and especially the home front command will do it. And therefore, if one says that Netanyahu was successful, how do you explain Bennett's rise? Another point is that there is a lot of civic unrest, which is not well reflected in the polls. All of these demonstrations that you see day in and day out, and especially Sabbath in and Sabbath out, they are reflecting some bitterness, some opposition to Netanyahu personally and to his policies, especially as regards the economy. Many people have been unemployed. Many small businesses were closed. This must be reflected in the elections, even though right now the polls don't show it.
You're talking, of course, about the ramifications of the corona crisis as the economic backlash, if you will, from various shutdowns has not even really emerged at this stage, and it seems that we're only nearing that. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Freeman, to what degree is the Israeli public concerned about those ramifications, or is it just taking one day at a time? And to what degree will this be reflected on a possible election?
Well, I think the coronavirus has a big impact on the public. But I think if we look at what's going on around the world, we see Europe, we see United States, we see many countries which on the one hand we say, look at our situation, but then on the other hand we see what's their situation. It looks like there isn't a very better place to be in compared to Israel. I think that with all the protests and with all the ramifications, I think that Israel right now is weathering the storm in a very good way compared to the world. I think that could also be an impact on the relations between the UAE and Bahrain. We saw, for example, the agreement with the UAE that involves a big investment in coronavirus research in Israel, that the UAE chose us to do so. So I think there is a lot of trust that Israel is doing what's right when it comes to the virus. I think that we see a big gap between our own situation in the world. So I think when it comes to the elections, this could be a very big policy item on the campaigns, but I think push comes to shove, most people will feel that that's something that the government, in the end, no matter who it was, did the best that it could.
Mr. Barak?
First of all, I'll have to agree with Dr. Oren that, there was a total negligence on the part of Netanyahu, both as prime minister and as the acting health minister for the decade that he's been in office. Meaning, I'm not in any way suggesting that we were prepared in any way for this virus, and the hospitals have been, almost bankrupt, and there haven't been budgets for doctors and nurses, and it's one of those things that if it's not really, really broken and people aren't complaining about it, then let's not fix it. So I certainly agree with that. But as he was successful in marketing his success in the first wave by locking everyone down, and similar to what Yonatan said, that the rest of the world many places were collapsing. France, Italy, even to a certain extent the United States. And our numbers here were looking pretty good, both in terms of people that are catching the virus and in terms of the death rate, which was very, very low, and that our hospitals were able to have it. So he was successful in doing that. The other way that he stepped in,
however, as a former press advisor, however, you know that highlighting the most successful parts of each thing and not telling the whole story is a good way of marketing something, as also Mr. Oren mentioned. And when we're talking about borders, Israel is shut. So to close the borders in Israel is a lot easier than European countries and the United States and other places around the world. And at the same time, we're talking also about a country that entered into the previous crisis. It was third from the bottom in OECD when we're talking about beds, doctors, and nurses per capita.
Correct. But I would say, look, this is, as a press advisor, this is what the public sees. He sees him on the phone with the CEO of Pfizer saying, we got to get those vaccines before everyone else. And, I heard that you were maybe even, of Jewish heritage, and it's really important for you to send it over there. And we buy a few million of those. And then he gets on the phone with another, pharmaceutical company and negotiates a few million more. And we're almost at the point where I think we have more vaccines than we have people in the country. So people look at that. And I will say one thing in his credit in this whole thing, and that's not even something that he's done now. Let's go back 10, 11 years ago when he became prime minister, and the biggest pandemic danger was the swine flu. And he was able to negotiate, I believe it was with Novartis, 8 million doses for the swine flu, to get them in Israel, and then to even put in a clause that Israel can return the unused doses. So only about 20% of Israelis, I myself and my family included, decided to get the vaccine, and they returned all of them. So I give him credit during that swine flu that he took charge, that he got the vaccines, and Israelis kind of didn't take it seriously. This time around, he's had many, many failures along this coronavirus. not only healthcare, but the economy. The economy, we don't have a budget. It's a simple thing that psychologically even would give people confidence that we are on the right track. And he hasn't even done that. Besides that, people are not getting budgets. People do not have money to even go to the grocery store, some of them. Do not have money to pay mortgages, rents. There's serious problems, and he has not handled that correctly. But for his base, which is the right of center, religious, Sephardic base, getting on the phone and arguing with the head of Pfizer and getting on the phone and arguing with the other pharmaceutical CEOs and getting those viruses in and visiting the places where they're going to come in. And I'm sure he's going to meet one of these airplanes. If it's not this week, he's going to meet the airplane coming in. Those are the visuals that his people want to see. And they're going to say he's successful in getting it when the United States, they just published, is not going to even get viruses for another 6 or 8 months for more than they ordered. Indeed. And that's going to be considered a success.
This is a challenge, of course, considering the fact that 1 out of every 4 Israelis at some point was out of a job. Mr. Oren, I'd like to take another perspective. Most of the issues presented in today's panel are domestic issues, not necessarily on the global scale, but Israel has plenty of challenges when we're talking on the global scale, and, of course, both diplomatically and security related. To what degree now, when there is a projected shift of power in Washington, we see a shift of policy also in Europe, we see different aspects within Russia and China, with anger from China deriving from American reluctance to allow Israel enter into various deals with China. How is everything now set for Netanyahu to present himself as the person who can steer Israel within the international community, considering the drastic shifts that are currently occurring on the global stage?
For the last 4 years, Netanyahu has gotten a pass on the diplomatic front because his dream came true. A Republican administration, during his term in the 90s, Clinton was in power, then Obama was in power, they got in at the same time. It was a nightmare. And all of a sudden, 2016, against all expectations, Hillary Clinton loses, Donald Trump wins, and Netanyahu gets 4 years of calm and achievements, at least the way he can show it, the Jerusalem embassy, the Golan Heights, and what happened in the Gulf.
And significant achievements they are.
Well, one can argue about that, and one can see how the Biden administration could roll back, not the stylistic side of it. They are not going to move the embassy back. By the way, the embassy is still in Tel Aviv. There are very, very few activities going on in Jerusalem. But as we all agree, what is important is what's on television. So if you break the ground for a new facility, even though the ambassador lives at Herzliya and 90% or more of his staff are still around it, it doesn't matter. But the question is, how come we are spending now almost half an hour speaking about only one contender? We forgot. We started speaking about Benny Gantz, but he was left by the roadside. We forgot all about him. And the others mentioned Bennett, Lapid. They are secondary figures in this play that Netanyahu is producing, directing, and having a main role in. So President Biden, if he gets his cabinet and staff in order, come February, March, could have an impact if he starts going back to the old Obama policies.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to still hear your positions on the foreign stage aspect. So, Dr. Freeman, we'll start with you.
Well, I think indeed there are big foreign issues that are at play here. We have a potential change in the White House in terms of policies when it comes to Israel, but also to other countries like China, like Iran, things that could impact the way that the political campaign is held here in Israel. I can tell you that, for example, even though it seems like it was very peaceful between Trump and Netanyahu during these 4 years, there was increased pressure when it comes to Israel-China relations. That's going to increase even more with the new administration. This could cause big problems in terms of our trade, in terms of our economy. Very much if we now move away from Beijing and go into the American camp. I think also the Iranian deal, the nuclear deal that might now involve America rejoining it, that could also be a big part of the campaign here, especially because of Netanyahu and his position that he was able to persuade America to leave it, but now it's going back again. So I think indeed developments on the world stage could cause certain aspects on the one hand to maybe strengthen Netanyahu's position, but on the other hand weaken his position in the eyes of the voters.
Mr. Barak, you have 50 seconds.
Well, I think we're 2 points, and Mr. Oren brought them up very nicely. There's really only one contender here. I mean, at least in the last 3 elections, we were talking about an alternative, and kind of Gantz has ruined that for himself by going on this political suicide mission by joining a coalition government which has failed miserably. And I think it's a very good point of both of the other guests that President Biden is coming in January 20th. It's going to be a different situation. Netanyahu deep down is hoping that he's going to rush back to the Iranian agreement, that he's going to start criticizing Israel, because that's where Netanyahu wants to be. He wants to be the foil. He wants to be the only guy that can save Israel against this horrible anti-Israel administration that is going to, cause a nuclear catastrophe in Israel by getting together with the Iranians and making us make concessions with the Palestinians.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Freeman, Mr. Barak, and Mr. Oren for being in today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.